Welcome to the caves of Nottingham Castle. As you go round, you'll see many different aspects of the caves. We'll start with this one. This one dates back to the medieval castle, and it was the base of a tower called Rondelow's Tower. You'll visit King David's dungeon, where King David II of Scotland was captured and kept prisoner here in the 1300s. Then you'll leave the dungeon, go off into the courtyard. You'll hear about the Duke of Newcastle and it being a ducal palace. Walking through the grounds, you'll go onto the terrace and then down Mortimer's Hole. And you'll hear about the story of Mortimer and how it dates back to 1330 when he was captured here and taken to London to be executed. And then you'll continue down the tunnel and you'll finish at Brewhouse Yard at the base of the rock. So this is the dungeon at Nottingham Castle. This is where the prisoners would have entered. And as you look round the dungeon, you see the holes in the wall. That's where the metal rings went. Metal rings were hammered into the walls, and then the prisoners in their chains and manacles were attached to those metal rings. You can imagine what it was like to be a prisoner down here, very dark and dank, a bit of straw on the floor, and the jailer coming to give you some bread and water. The name of the dungeon is actually King David's dungeon, and it relates back to King David II of Scotland. The King of England was Edward III. They have a big battle at a place called Neville's Cross, which is near Durham. And David, though being very brave, because he received 2 arrows in his face during the battle, was actually captured and held to ransom. And for some of that time, they think he was kept down here in the dungeon. The dungeon's been used for many things over the centuries. At the time of the Civil War, they think it was used as an arsenal. Gunpowder and muskets were actually kept down here in the old dungeon.
Nottingham Castle. It's obviously not the medieval castle that it once was. So how do we go from having, in the 1500s, one of the biggest, most beautiful stone castles in the country, to having a 17th century ducal palace and an interesting rockery? Well, it all starts going bad for Nottingham Castle in the year 1500, when Richard III rides away from Nottingham Castle on his way to Bosworth Field, where he becomes the last British king to die in battle. Fast forward a few hundred years later to the start of the English Civil War, and this place is nothing but a ruin. Nottingham Castle was an important centrally located castle, and this is where Charles I raised his standard on August the 22nd, 1642. But within a few hours, the standard, his flag, had fallen. The people around him felt that this was a bad omen, and for Charles it probably was, because by the end of the English Civil War, he'd lost not only his battle, he'd lost the war, and he even lost his head. Charles left Nottingham and headed towards Worcester and Shrewsbury, where the first major battles of the English Civil War occurred. This left Nottingham to be taken over by the parliamentarians under the command of Colonel John Hutchinson. Colonel John Hutchinson and his wife Lucy felt that this place wasn't fit for human habitation. In fact, Lucy was said to say that this place wasn't even fit for housing animals. However, they did stay here throughout the English Civil War. They rebuilt sections, they fortified it, they held it throughout siege, including one that came from the tower of St Nicholas's Church. Nottingham Castle was held by the parliamentarians until the very end of the English Civil War, when Colonel John Hutchinson believed the leader of his own side, Oliver Cromwell, was trying to put himself in the place of the king, whom they'd just beheaded. Now at this point, Hutchinson applied to Parliament to have what was left of the remains of Nottingham Castle completely destroyed, so that Cromwell couldn't use it in yet another English Civil War. So at the end of the English Civil War, the Nottingham Castle rock was nothing but a blank canvas, waiting for a new building. William Cavendish had been a general in the Royalist army. He'd fought for his king, and he'd been at a battle called Marsden Moor. And at Marsden Moor, he'd sent his men in where he knew that they could not survive. He saw which way the battle was going, told his men to fight for their lives, and he ran. He ran away. He ran as far as Europe, and there he saw the beautiful palaces of Italy. He eventually returned to England when Charles II was restored to the throne, and then he was given the land here at Nottingham Castle to build his ducal palace.
The tunnel you're going to explore got provisions into the castle. The Normans could come from the sea, travel all the way down the Trent and actually reach Nottingham in the distance. The big building with the green roof, that's County Hall. and the River Trent is just in front of that. So they've travelled down the Trent and they reach Nottingham. What they do then, they divert a smaller river called the River Leen, and that was off to the west. They divert that one to flow past the base of the rock. So from the Trent they've gone onto the Leen, now they're down beneath us with a boat full of cargo. What they do then, they carve out a tunnel. And if you come over here, you'll see the top of the tunnel. We're on the terrace of the castle now, and this is the top of Mortimer's Hole. If you look down into the tunnel, you see it's quite wide. But when the Normans built the first tunnel here, there was a wooden spiral staircase built into this. They come up the spiral staircase and into the castle itself. Also built here was a tower with soldiers in it protecting this tunnel, just in case opposition soldiers ever got into the tunnel itself.
The tunnelway here was probably dug out in the 12th century. Good King Richard came here in 1194 and ordered a postern be dug, giving access to the motte, the castle keep above me. You can see behind steps leading up to the castle keep, and further down there would be steps and gates leading down to an exit just at the bottom of the cliffs. This passageway would enable us to bring goods up into the castle keep, protected from outlaws like that Robin Hood, but it would also enable us to have a sally port, which was just a way for soldiers like me to sneak out of the castle grounds and attack an enemy so that we could be protected and cause a bit of havoc amongst them. Right, so while soldiers like me would be able to sneak out of the castle, the passageway was actually used to sneak in at a later date. Let me tell you the story. There was a lord called Roger Mortimer, and he managed to get this beauty called Isabella to fall in love with him. Unfortunately, Isabella was in fact the Queen of England, so Roger had someone standing in his way, and that was King Edward II. However, he managed to get rid of Edward II in a vile and despicable way. Apparently, he had a red-hot poker shoved up his bottom. Nasty. So, with Edward II out of the way, and the young King Edward III not old enough to rule properly, Roger Mortimer was able to put himself on the throne and have Isabella at his side. However, as time went on, Edward, the young Edward, became 18. He was old enough to go out drinking with his mates, but he was also old enough to become the true King of England, and Roger Mortimer knew this. So, in the October of 1330, Roger Mortimer and Queen Isabella came here to the castle to hold council, although they probably came because the castle was one of the best defended in the land. Mortimer had about 180 knights surrounding him to make himself protected from Edward, because he was afraid that Edward might come along and bump him off. And even Queen Isabella had the castle keys put under her pillow at night. Even though Roger Mortimer felt safe inside the castle, he wasn't. The castle commander secretly sneaked down the tunnelway here at night and let in, at the bottom, on the 19th of October 1330, 24 knights who were in cahoots with King Edward III. They raced up the tunnelway here, made their way to the castle keep, seized and confronted Roger Mortimer and dragged him back down the tunnelway to be taken to London. The Queen, Isabella, cried, "Fair son, pity for the gentle Mortimer, do not take him." But he was taken, he was tried for treason, and he was hanged and executed. Some say, on certain nights, you can still hear Isabella crying out for her gentle Mortimer. But it could just be the wind. It fairly gusts down here on some nights.
So the river came through here. The Normans came up in their boats, they moored here, and then the provisions went up the tunnel and into the castle. Also built here was a mill. That's why the grinding wheels there, marking that fact. And when the miller finished his day's work, he lived there. There were steps on this side, he went up his steps, and that's where he lived. That's the miller's cottage. I've seen old paintings of this area, 1700s, and this had a wooden front to this, and you can still see where the post holes went in the top. So we hope you've enjoyed the tour, and if you'd like to experience it for yourself, the tickets are sold in the shop area. Thank you.